When rescue teams found veteran Marine Jake Sullivan 3 days after he'd gone missing in the Colorado Rockies, they couldn't believe what they discovered. A wild bobcat had been standing guard over his broken body, bringing him water and driving away predators in an act of interspecies loyalty that defied everything wildlife experts thought they knew about these solitary hunters. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain of Rocky Mountain National Park as Jake Sullivan adjusted his weathered hiking boots and checked his GPS one final time. At 34, the decorated Afghanistan veteran had found solace in these mountains ever since returning home 2 years ago. The trails offered him something the crowded streets of Denver couldn't: silence that didn't remind him of distant explosions, and solitude that felt peaceful rather than isolating. Jake had been coming to this particular section of the park for 18 months, always taking the same route along Bear Creek Trail before branching off onto the more challenging Sentinel Peak path. Today marked his 15th solo expedition to the summit, a personal ritual that had become as essential to his healing process as his weekly therapy sessions. The familiar weight of his olive green military surplus backpack, loaded with 3 days' worth of supplies, felt reassuring against his shoulders. The trail ahead wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine and aspen, their leaves just beginning to hint at the golden transformation that would soon paint the mountainside. Jake moved with the measured pace of someone who understood that the mountain demanded respect, not speed. His hiking techniques, refined through countless missions in the Hindu Kush, served him well here, where a single misstep could mean the difference between a successful summit and a dangerous fall. As he climbed higher, the familiar sounds of the forest surrounded him: the distant call of a red-tailed hawk, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush, and the gentle whisper of wind through pine needles. These sounds had become his meditation, replacing the hypervigilance that had kept him alive overseas but made civilian life feel like navigating a minefield. Here, among the granite peaks and alpine meadows, Jake Sullivan could finally breathe without constantly scanning for threats that existed only in his memory. The accident happened so quickly that Jake barely had time to register the loose shale beneath his boots before the world tilted sideways. One moment he was carefully navigating a narrow ledge along Sentinel Peak's eastern face. The next, he was tumbling through space, his body bouncing off rocky outcroppings as gravity claimed him. The sickening crack of bone against stone echoed through the canyon as he finally came to rest on a narrow shelf 30 feet below the main trail, his left leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Pain shot through his body like lightning, but years of military training kicked in immediately. Jake forced himself to remain conscious, mentally cataloging his injuries through gritted teeth. His left femur was clearly broken, the bone likely fractured in multiple places based on the way his leg refused to support any weight. Blood seeped through his hiking pants from numerous cuts and scrapes, and his right shoulder felt dislocated from the violent impact against the cliff face. Most concerning was the sharp pain in his ribs when he tried to breathe deeply, suggesting possible internal injuries. Fighting through waves of nausea, Jake managed to reach his backpack, which had miraculously landed beside him rather than continuing its descent into the rocky abyss below. His satellite emergency beacon lay shattered among the scattered contents, its broken antenna rendering his primary means of communication useless. His cell phone showed no signal bars, a reality he'd expected at this elevation, but one that now felt like a death sentence. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd survived multiple IED explosions in Afghanistan, only to be defeated by Colorado shale. As the initial shock began to wear off, the full gravity of his situation became clear. He was trapped on a ledge that couldn't be seen from the main trail, with injuries that made climbing impossible and no way to call for help. The nearest ranger station was 15 miles away, and he'd told no one his exact route, a decision that had seemed wise for maintaining his solitude, but now appeared catastrophically foolish. The October temperatures would drop below freezing after sunset, and hypothermia would become as dangerous as his broken bones. Jake closed his eyes and tried to push down the rising panic, knowing that his survival now depended entirely on whether someone would notice he was missing before it was too late. The first sign that Jake wasn't alone came as a low, rumbling growl from somewhere above his position on the ledge. Through his pain-hazed vision, he spotted movement among the rocky outcroppings, a tawny form with distinctive black-tipped ears and a stubby tail that immediately identified it as a bobcat. The animal was larger than Jake had expected, probably around 30 pounds, with powerful shoulders and piercing amber eyes that seemed to be studying him with unusual intensity. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Jake's military training had taught him to remain still when encountering potentially dangerous wildlife, but this bobcat's behavior defied everything he knew about these typically elusive creatures. Instead of fleeing at the sight of a human, the animal moved closer, picking its way carefully down the rocky slope until it reached a position roughly 10 feet away from Jake's broken body. There it sat, perfectly still except for the occasional twitch of its black-tipped tail, watching him with an expression that seemed almost protective. What happened next challenged every assumption Jake had about wild animal behavior. The bobcat began to pace back and forth along the narrow ledge, occasionally stopping to look directly at Jake before resuming its patrol. When a turkey vulture circled overhead, the cat immediately stood alert, its hackles raised as it issued a warning hiss that sent the scavenger bird wheeling away into the distance. This wasn't the behavior of a predator sizing up potential prey. This was the behavior of a guardian establishing territory. As the hours passed, Jake realized with growing amazement that the bobcat had no intention of leaving. The animal had somehow recognized his helpless state and appointed itself as his protector. When Jake tried to shift position to relieve pressure on his broken leg, the bobcat would approach slightly as if checking on his condition before resuming its vigilant watch. The creature's presence was both comforting and bewildering. In his 2 years of hiking these mountains, Jake had never seen a bobcat, let alone one that displayed such inexplicable loyalty to a human stranger. By late afternoon, as shadows began to lengthen across the canyon, Jake understood that this extraordinary animal had made a choice that went against every instinct of its species. For reasons he couldn't begin to fathom, this solitary hunter had decided that protecting one injured veteran was more important than following its natural impulses to avoid human contact. As darkness settled over the Rocky Mountains, Jake's situation became increasingly desperate. His broken leg throbbed with each heartbeat, and the October cold was beginning to seep through his clothing. Hypothermia would be his greatest enemy now, followed closely by dehydration and the possibility of his injuries worsening without medical attention. He estimated that search parties wouldn't even begin looking for him until tomorrow evening at the earliest, since he'd planned a 3-day solo expedition, and no one expected him back until then. The bobcat seemed to sense the changing conditions and adapted its behavior accordingly. As temperatures dropped, the animal moved closer to Jake's position, eventually settling down just 5 feet away, close enough that Jake could hear its steady breathing and see the gleam of its eyes in the moonlight. The warmth radiating from the cat's body provided minimal but psychologically comforting relief from the bitter mountain air. What the bobcat did next defied all logic and scientific understanding of feline behavior. Around midnight, Jake watched in amazement as the animal disappeared into the darkness, only to return 30 minutes later carrying something in its mouth. At first, Jake couldn't make out what it was, but as the bobcat approached and dropped the object near his head, he realized it was a small piece of ice from a nearby frozen stream. The animal had somehow understood that Jake needed water and had brought him the only source available at this elevation. Throughout the long night, the bobcat repeated this extraordinary behavior multiple times, each trip bringing back small fragments of ice that Jake could melt in his mouth for precious hydration. Between these water runs, the animal maintained its protective vigil, twice driving away what sounded like a pack of coyotes with fierce snarls and aggressive posturing. The cat's dedication was absolute. It never strayed far from Jake's position and seemed to anticipate his needs before he even recognized them himself. When dawn finally broke across the mountain peaks, Jake found the bobcat curled up nearby, its golden fur touched with frost, but its amber eyes alert and watchful. The animal had spent the entire night protecting and caring for him, displaying a level of interspecies empathy that challenged everything biologists thought they knew about wild predator behavior. Jake whispered a quiet thank you to his unlikely guardian, wondering if anyone would ever believe this incredible story of survival and compassion. On the second day, Jake's condition began to deteriorate rapidly. His broken leg had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the pain now constant and excruciating despite his attempts to fashion a makeshift splint from broken branches. Fever had set in, likely from infection in his deeper wounds, and he found himself drifting in and out of consciousness as his body struggled to cope with the trauma and exposure. The metallic taste of blood in his mouth suggested internal bleeding, and his vision occasionally blurred as shock threatened to overwhelm his system. The bobcat's behavior evolved with Jake's declining health, becoming even more protective and resourceful. The animal had established a complex routine that seemed designed entirely around Jake's survival needs. Every few hours, it would disappear for exactly 20 to 30 minutes, returning with fresh ice fragments for hydration. But now it had added something new to its repertoire: small pieces of bark from specific trees that Jake recognized as having natural antiseptic properties, as if the cat instinctively understood the concept of primitive medicine. When Jake's fever spiked during the afternoon, causing violent shivering fits, the bobcat made perhaps its most remarkable decision yet. The normally solitary creature lay down directly against Jake's body, sharing its body heat in a display of trust and compassion that seemed to transcend species boundaries. The warmth from the cat's fur helped stabilize Jake's core temperature during the most critical hours when hypothermia could have proven fatal. The bobcat's protective instincts reached their peak when a black bear wandered into the area, drawn by the scent of blood. Jake watched helplessly as his feline guardian transformed into a fierce defender, positioning itself between the much larger predator and the injured human. Despite weighing less than a quarter of the bear's mass, the bobcat stood its ground with arched back and bared fangs, issuing a series of aggressive snarls that echoed off the canyon walls. The confrontation lasted nearly 10 minutes before the bear, apparently deciding the meal wasn't worth the fight, shambled away into the forest. As the second night approached, Jake realized that this extraordinary animal had essentially abandoned its normal hunting patterns, territorial behavior, and survival instincts to become its full-time caregiver. The bobcat was risking starvation and exposure to protect a creature that, by all natural laws, should have been ignored or viewed as potential prey. The breakthrough came on the third morning when Jake heard the distant whir of helicopter rotors cutting through the mountain air. His girlfriend Sarah had finally contacted park rangers when he failed to check in as promised, triggering a massive search and rescue operation across the entire Sentinel Peak area. The bobcat's ears perked up immediately at the unfamiliar sound, its amber eyes scanning the sky with obvious concern as the aircraft grew closer to their position on the hidden ledge. What happened next would become the stuff of legend among search and rescue teams. As the helicopter passed overhead without spotting Jake's location, the bobcat did something that defied every known behavior pattern of its species. The animal began to move in deliberate, repetitive patterns across the ledge, pacing back and forth in a figure-8 formation while periodically stopping to look up at the sky and emit loud, carrying yowls that echoed off the canyon walls. Captain Maria Rodriguez, leading the aerial search team, noticed the unusual movement below through her binoculars. 23 years of search and rescue experience had taught her that wildlife rarely behaved so conspicuously unless something significant was happening. She directed pilot James Morrison to circle back for a closer look. And that's when they spotted Jake's motionless form on the narrow shelf, with the Bobcat continuing its urgent signaling behavior just feet away from the injured hiker. The rescue itself presented enormous challenges. The ledge was too narrow and unstable for a standard helicopter landing, requiring a technical rope rescue operation that took over 4 hours to execute safely. Throughout the entire process, the Bobcat never left Jake's side, watching with apparent understanding as the rescue team rappelled down to assess his condition. Paramedic David Chen later reported that the animal seemed to recognize they were there to help, stepping back only when necessary but maintaining a protective vigil that continued even after Jake was secured in the rescue harness. As Jake was finally lifted toward the helicopter, semi-conscious but stable, he managed one last look down at his extraordinary guardian. The Bobcat sat perfectly still on the ledge, its golden coat gleaming in the afternoon sunlight, watching until the aircraft disappeared over the mountain ridge. The animal had accomplished something unprecedented in the annals of wildlife behavior. It had actively participated in orchestrating a human rescue, using intelligence and communication skills that science was only beginning to understand. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. At Denver General Hospital, Jake underwent 8 hours of emergency surgery to repair his shattered femur, requiring multiple titanium plates and screws to reconstruct the bone. Dr. Angela Martinez, the orthopedic surgeon, described his injuries as some of the most severe she'd seen from a hiking accident, with additional complications from 3 days of exposure and the early stages of pneumonia. His survival, she noted in her medical report, bordered on miraculous, given the combination of trauma, hypothermia, and dehydration he'd endured. During his recovery, Jake's story began to spread through the hospital staff and eventually reached local news outlets. Wildlife biologist Dr. Samuel Torres from Colorado State University contacted Jake directly, explaining that the Bobcat's behavior represented something completely unprecedented in scientific literature. No documented case existed of a wild bobcat providing extended care for an injured human, let alone actively participating in signaling for rescue. Dr. Torres requested permission to study the incident, believing it could fundamentally change understanding of feline intelligence and interspecies empathy. 3 weeks after the rescue, Jake faced a decision that tore at his heart. Park officials informed him that they'd been monitoring the bobcat, now designated as guardian by the research team, and discovered troubling changes in the animal's behavior. The cat had remained near the rescue site for days after Jake's evacuation, apparently searching for him and refusing to resume normal hunting patterns. It had lost significant weight and showed signs of stress-related behavior that concerned wildlife experts. Dr. Torres presented Jake with a difficult choice. The bobcat needed to be relocated to prevent it from starving while waiting for Jake's return, but the animal's unusual attachment to humans made traditional relocation problematic. The cat couldn't be released into unfamiliar territory where it might seek out other humans, potentially creating dangerous situations. Yet keeping it in captivity seemed like a betrayal of the wild creature that had saved his life through its natural instincts and intelligence. The solution they proposed was unprecedented, establishing a special wildlife sanctuary specifically for Guardian, where the bobcat could live in a semi-natural environment while being monitored and cared for by researchers. Jake would be able to visit regularly, maintaining the bond that had saved his life while allowing scientists to study this remarkable animal's unique behavioral patterns. 6 months after his rescue, Jake stood at the observation deck of the newly established Guardian Wildlife Research Center, watching his four-legged savior navigate the 20-acre sanctuary that had been built specifically for their unique situation. The bobcat had adapted remarkably well to his new environment, displaying the same intelligence and problem-solving abilities that had made their mountain survival possible. Dr. Torres and his research team had documented over 40 distinct behavioral innovations that Guardian had developed, which were now being studied to better understand feline cognitive abilities. The center had become a pilgrimage site for people from around the world who wanted to witness the bobcat that had rewritten the rules of animal behavior. Guardian's story had inspired the creation of new wildlife protection protocols throughout Colorado's national parks, including mandatory GPS tracking for solo hikers and improved emergency response systems designed around animal behavior patterns. The Guardian Protocol now trained search and rescue teams to recognize when wildlife might be indicating human distress, potentially saving countless lives in wilderness emergencies. Jake's weekly visits to the sanctuary had become therapeutic for both man and cat. Guardian would approach the observation area whenever Jake arrived, often bringing small objects, stones, interesting twigs, or colorful leaves that he would place near the fence as if offering gifts. The bond between them remained as strong as it had been on that mountain.
Ledge, transcending the barriers between wild and domestic, human and animal. Jake's PTSD symptoms had dramatically improved since the accident, as if his traumatic experience had been transformed into something healing through Guardian's extraordinary compassion. The research center published findings that revolutionized wildlife psychology, documenting Guardian's ability to recognize human emotional states, his problem-solving skills that rivaled those of domesticated animals, and his continued demonstration of empathy toward visiting veterans who came to see him. Jake had established a foundation using proceeds from his book about the experience, funding research into animal cognition and providing support for wounded veterans through wilderness therapy programs. Standing there watching Guardian bask in the afternoon sun, Jake reflected on how a moment of crisis had become a bridge between two species, proving that love and loyalty weren't uniquely human traits. The bobcat that had refused to abandon him had given the world something far greater than a rescue story. He had offered proof that compassion exists throughout the natural world, waiting to be recognized and honored by those wise enough to see it. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 1 year after the rescue, Jake received an unexpected call from Dr. Torres. Guardian had done something extraordinary once again. The research team's trail cameras had captured footage of the bobcat teaching survival techniques to 3 orphaned bobcat kittens that had been brought to the sanctuary. Guardian was demonstrating the same protective behaviors he'd shown Jake, bringing the young cats water, sharing food, and standing guard while they slept. The wild animal that had learned to care for a human was now passing those compassionate instincts to his own kind. The discovery led to a groundbreaking new program where Guardian became the world's first wild bobcat foster parent, helping rehabilitate orphaned cubs for eventual release back into the wild. His unique combination of wild instincts and learned empathy made him the perfect mentor for young cats who needed both survival skills and emotional healing. Jake watched through tears as Guardian gently guided a particularly timid cub to a water source, using the same patient movements he'd shown during those desperate mountain nights. Today, the Guardian Wildlife Research Center has become a beacon of hope for wildlife conservation, proving that individual animals possess complex emotional lives worthy of protection and study. Guardian's legacy lives on not just in the lives he's directly saved, but in the thousands of people inspired by his story to see wildlife as more than just animals, as fellow beings capable of profound love and sacrifice. Every time Jake visits, Guardian still approaches the fence with that familiar amber-eyed gaze, as if to say that some bonds transcend species and last forever. Their story reminds us that heroes come in all forms, and sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen when no one is watching, except the one life that matters most. If Guardian's incredible story of loyalty and love moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more amazing wildlife stories that will restore your faith in the natural world. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that compassion exists everywhere around us.